Okay, hello everyone, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Rachel Wesson. I am the Events and Communications Specialist at the UC Berkeley Center for Long-Term Cybersecurity, and it is my pleasure to welcome all of you to our discussion today on responsible AI licensing, brought to you by the AI Security Initiative at CLTC, as well as the AI Policy Hub and the Algorithmic Fairness and Opacity Group, all at UC Berkeley. With that, it's my pleasure to introduce one of our co-moderators for today's discussion, Hanlin Li. Hanlin is a postdoctoral scholar at the Center for Long-Term Cybersecurity, and very soon an incoming assistant professor at UT Austin. Her work focuses on the social and economic impact of user-generated data and explores approaches to collective responsible data governance. So Hanlin, over to you.
Thanks, Rachel. Hi, everyone. So as Rachel mentioned, I'm going to be your co-host today, just to provide a little bit more further context about our panel. So with the emergence of a lot of large AI models we have seen over the past few months, from ChatGPT to Midjourney, we have seen a lot of different approaches to responsible AI, which prompted our to look at responsible AI licensing. And I will leave it to Carlos and Danish to talk about more about what responsible AI licensing means. So we're very fortunate to have them joining us to give an overview of the initiative, which is also short for RAIL. And we're also fortunate to have two experts on open source and policy, Kat Walsh and Madhu Srikumar, to discuss their related work on responsible AI and how these different approaches complement with each other. With that context given, I'm going to invite all of our panelists turning on their video and their audio to give us to tell us their name, title, and affiliation, and one sentence what you are currently working on that's related to responsible AI. Based on the screen, let's maybe start with Kat, Danish, Madhu, and Carlos.
Hi, I'm Kat Walsh. I'm the General Counsel at Creative Commons. And CC is a nonprofit organization dedicated to reducing legal barriers to the commons and access to knowledge. We have a suite of licenses that many people use for their copyrightable works to share them. And a lot of people have been asking us recently how those apply to AI and to materials that may be used to train AI. So we're trying to figure out the best approach for licensing training data and other AI-related materials in service of an open commons, an open and responsible sharing.
Hi, this is Danish. I'm representing the Responsible AI Licensing Initiative. We've been looking at many things in RAIL. More recently, we've been looking at ways of making this more accessible, build tooling, standardizing languages, and such, and hopefully we'll get to some of those topics during the rest of the panel discussion.
Great, I think it's my turn to jump in. My name is Madhu, and I work at Partnership on AI, which is a global not-for-profit multi-stakeholder organization that's dedicated to advancing best practices and governance in the field of AI. So the Partnership on AI has various programs that delve into distinct societal impacts and dimensions of AI governance, and I lead the AI Safety Governance Program. And I'm currently leading a project on developing shared protocols for safe and responsible large-scale AI deployment. So these are essentially participatory norms that we are collectively authoring with representatives from industry, civil society, and academia. And they're meant to provide like a standardized approach to guide decision-making during the deployment process of foundation models. Over to, who's going next? Sorry.
Carlos, you're next.
Yes, hi everyone. Carlos here. I'm Tech and Regulatory Affairs Counsel at Hugging Face. So we are an open ML platform where everyone can upload, download machine learning models, but also training data sets. I'm also part of the OECD AI group of experts on AI, and I am nowadays focused on experimental regulation in AI and open and collaborative governance in AI.
Right. With that introduction over, I'm going to pass this to my co-host, Jessica Newman.
Thanks, Hanlin, and hi, everyone. It's great to see you all, and I'm excited to dive into this timely discussion as questions around the spectrum of OpenAI and how to effectively mitigate harms have never been more critical. My name is Jessica Newman, and I'm the director of the AI Security Initiative and co-director of the AI Policy Hub here at CLTC. It's my pleasure to help moderate today's event with our distinguished panelists. So for our discussion, we will first turn to Danish and Carlos, who are two of the founding members of the Rail Initiative, to hear firsthand about what responsible AI licensing, or Rail, is and how developers are actually using it. Then we will turn to Kat and Madhu to hear about how Rail relates to other responsible AI governance mechanisms. Then Hanlin will lead a discussion on some of the challenges and ways forward. So to get us started, Danish, can you please tell us what is responsible AI licensing? Where did this concept come from? And what are some examples that are out there?
Sure. Thank you, Jessica. So the concept of a rail license is fairly simple. It emerges from the need to maybe think about the use or the limitations of the technology that you're releasing, be it a model, be it source code, be it a combination of both. We're also exploring the use of data, but that aside. And it basically it's just an approach to just say that when you're releasing something, think about the use, put in usage restrictions or limitations that are indicative of what you know about the technology, and make sure that anybody who's using that technology downstream has to comply with those terms. That's basically the idea of a rail license in a nutshell. There are versions of this that have now been developed specifically focused on models, machine learning models, specifically focused only on source code, combinations of both. There have been versions that have been released with existing large-scale models that vary the kind of usage restrictions based on what has been learned about them in the model card and interrogation of those models. So what changes between these flavors of licenses is the usage restrictions and what they apply to. And if there's a version of it which is also referred to as OpenRail commonly, where these also just allow free distribution with no commercial restrictions, as long as usage restrictions are followed.
Thank you so much for the helpful background. And Carlos, can you help us dive more into the weeds of how this is used in practice? For example, what is BigScience Rail M, and how are developers using Rail on the Hugging Face Hub?
Yes, thanks, Jessica. So BigScience OpenRail M, or for instance, BigCode OpenRail M, are two very specific examples of rail licenses that were developed under open and collaborative research workshops. The first one, BigScience, last year, where we were training a large language model, multilingual one called Bloom. And for this model, we were discussing whether to place an open source commercial license, so an Apache 2.0 license, or a more restrictive license due to communities' concerns on potential misuses or use of this large language model. And therefore, we ended up developing this very specific, first of all, ML-specific license, so for a large language model, a different artifact than source code, and second of all, placing a set of use restrictions, right? With BigCode, it happened the same. The LLM we have developed and trained this year is StarCoder. We developed a different version, also of an OpenRail license, in partnership also with ServiceNow, which was the other sponsor of this open and collaborative LLM development project. And the same with a set of use restrictions. This time, what we also added is a requirement basically stating to the licensee that in case they are going to share the LLM again, or a modified version of the LLM, they will have to provide also a copy of the explanatory documentation, which means, for instance, the model card or the data card, in order also to promote transparency or documentation once the model is shared along the value chain, right? So these are two of the very specific examples. We have other different examples of Rail-like licenses, not promoted by the Rail initiative, but quite similar, such as, for instance, Meta latest releases of their own for research purposes, open license for their LLMs. And just recently, Meta, as you may know, released the Llama or Llama 2, version 2, with a very new specific license, rail-like license, but for commercial purposes this time, and integrating or making a reference to their usage policy when it comes to the use of the model, right? So you are seeing two things from starting from last year on. First of all, we are starting to see ML-specific licenses, not just traditional source code licenses to license artifacts such as models, but also some specific use restrictions on uses of these new tools.
Thank you, Carlos. And thanks for bringing up the recent example of Llama 2 just released this morning. It is really interesting to see how, rail-like other kinds of use restrictions are starting to come out there, and the kind of impact that this work is having. So Danish, is there anything else that you would add to what Carlos has just said, for example, about how rail has been adopted in other places, or how it differs from other licensing schemes?
So the family of rail licenses differs from, let's say, if you were to consider open source, right? Like, what is the guiding principle of open source, and why? How is an open rail M license different? At the outset, I would like to believe the main difference between a traditional open source license and an open rail M license is the requirement of including usage restrictions. From my perspective, I think there is no other difference in how open source licenses function and the way open rail M licenses function. And in terms of, so I think that's how I would maybe categorize the distinction, with like one big family of licenses that people here might be familiar with, which is open source. And in terms of the adoption, I think a lot of adoption that has happened has come from major or big models that have been released under rail licenses, and then derivative works that are applying rail licenses from them. There are instances of developers also posting source code and models directly onto GitHub by attaching rail licenses. But I think it's also a little hard to track where how usage is spreading. But I think one place that the Hugging Face hub makes it easy for us to track is at least derivatives of models that are hosted on Hugging Face. And I think there are thousands of models right now that are at least derivatives of big models that then proceed with further rail licenses. I think the Stability AI model was also one that is a prominent one featuring a rail license. I think BigCode and BigScience, Carlos already mentioned. I think that's what I would say where majority of the use is coming from right now.
Thank you so much. So now I want to turn to you, Kat. Can you tell us about how the Creative Commons license that you've helped develop differs from the Responsible AI license? And how does Creative Commons grapple with the tension between openness and content creators' concerns about generative AI like DALL-E and Stable Diffusion?
Sure. So the Creative Commons licenses are more in the traditional open source model. There are general purpose licenses intended to apply not just to material that may be used to train AI, but any sort of creative or copyrightable content that you may wish to publish. There's no field of use restrictions in the CC licenses whatsoever. The closest thing we have would be the non-commercial licenses, which aren't intended to say that the works shouldn't be used for commerce whatsoever, but more to secure a revenue stream for an artist that may be depending on that when they're okay with free non-commercial distribution. The philosophy behind the CC licenses was mainly that the default system of copyright was too restrictive and didn't reflect the ways that people wanted and needed to share online. So that they take a minimal view of copyright in order to release some of those restrictions and more accurately reflect the ways that people need and want to share. Which isn't to say that we don't think that we agree with all uses that the CC licensed material may be put to. Certainly, like uses that may put forward like discrimination or hate speech or things like that. Like we don't approve of those uses. We've spoken out against those uses, but what we think is that putting them in the license isn't the way that we would go forward with it. We support alternative approaches such as like responsible use policies or like regulations regarding things like privacy. Codes of conduct, codes of best practices, but not in the license themselves. And there's a few reasons for this. One is that we think that copyright isn't intended for that and doesn't actually function that way. And the other is that a licensing decision has a couple of reasons. And a main difficulty with licensing is that you want it to be interoperable with other materials. You want it to be a decision that won't change. Whereas a lot of the ethical and usage standards should be more flexible, should be adapted to their communities, should be able to change. So putting those usage restrictions in the license themselves would be pretty difficult, and it's extremely hard to tailor them correctly so that you don't need to version them very much. So we've avoided putting those in the license and have a more general purpose approach.
Thank you, Kat. It's really interesting to hear about the different approaches. So Madhu, I'd love to bring you into the discussion from your unique vantage point, working with many different stakeholders at the Partnership on AI, and hear about how do you see Rail fitting into this broader responsible AI landscape, and what do you see as promising ways to facilitate the adoption of responsible AI practices in industry?
Great. I'm happy to kind of answer the first question first, which is how do I kind of see Rail fitting in the larger responsible AI landscape? I think what's really exciting is that licenses can help crystallize and advance community consensus where it exists. So Rail can serve as a valuable tool for fostering community consensus, particularly within the research community, as we heard regarding appropriate and inappropriate uses and limitations of AI models. The licenses can kind of provide a clear indication of the creator's intentions, and it can play a crucial role in shaping, community norms over time, and expectations around how these models should be utilized downstream, especially as value chains get more complex around the deployment of, perhaps general purpose AI or foundation models. But I think at the same time, much like what Kat just mentioned right now, it's perhaps important to recognize that model licenses themselves are unlikely to be the primary means for establishing community consensus on responsible AI. I think it can be very difficult for licenses alone to be, the initial source of community consensus regarding societal impacts or misuses or dual use implications of AI. I think they're one component within a larger kind of ecosystem of tools at our disposal. I think model licenses are better suited for translating existing consensus into practical implementation, and perhaps providing some flexibility to some license owners who want to set higher standards, if that's possible, for preventing specific uses or misuses. And I understand that, Rail is currently kind of restricting usage around specific harmful applications like surveillance and crime prediction. And I know that efforts are underway to enhance, the Rail licenses by incorporating new restrictions. So as we consider additional kind of restrictions to mitigate AI risks, I think one question is, can model licenses be used to contribute to harm reduction in both, other known risks and speculative risks? And I think that goes to Kat's question of whether that's something that needs to be baked into a license, or if that's better if it resides outside of a license as a mechanism. So I think that's kind of intriguing, especially let's take something like the blueprint for Bill of Rights from the White House that kind of offers a valuable framework for thinking about risks from a rights perspective. Can that or should that be encoded within a model license? I think is an interesting question for the future direction of Rail.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you so much, Madhu. So let me now pose a couple questions to the full group, and also feel free to pick up on any of the threads that you've heard from the other panelists. But the other questions we have in mind are about whether you see other legal frameworks and protections that currently exist that you think are encouraging the responsible uses of AI, and also what would you like to see moving forward? Carlos, go ahead.
Thank you. Super nice question. So I think the first practical example that everyone already knows here is the upcoming EUA Act, which is nowadays being discussed under their last legislative stage, which is the trialogue within the EU by the Council, Commission, and European Parliament, and we will likely have the final version by the end of this year. We see how the high risk or risk approach to regulate AI is trying to be played by the EU policymaker. My main concern, for instance, either with or without Rails, is how this EU AI Act is going to intersect with available open licensing standards, such as open source licenses, Creative Commons licenses, or even Rails licenses, right? The last or latest version proposed by the European Parliament already includes wording referring to a set of standard contractual terms to be included in AI commercial agreements along the value chain, right? So does this mean that we are going to be in need of drafting new specific addendums or clauses for already existing standards such as Creative Commons, Rails, or even open source licenses, right? So this is one already, let's say, common concern that we could identify.
Yeah, absolutely. Any other panelists want to jump in on this question?
Yeah, I feel like approaches that I would like to see are ones that address the harmful uses that we want to prevent rather than the technology itself. For example, there have been moves toward privacy legislation in various jurisdictions, which in my opinion should be technology neutral. Like a violation of privacy is a violation of privacy, whether it's done with AI or with any other means. Similar to uses that like policing in ways that don't allow people to assert their civil rights. Like that's AI will let you do that at greater scale, but it's unethical regardless of how you do it. Well, the things we always want to do with legislation is to stop the harmful uses without suppressing the beneficial uses. And I really want to be an enthusiast about AI. Like I think the promise of access to the world's knowledge in a way that is like, you know, access to all the things that have ever been published more than any scholar could ever read is exciting to me. So I've enjoyed playing with the text assistants to see like what information it can uncover. But I think it's the uses that people may put it to, and also we need to be able to grapple with the economic disruption that'll cause. A lot of what we see in the CC community is that artists and creators and other people working in those fields are going to be put out of work, and that's like. And like licensing is not a social safety net, but people want it to be because we need those things. Like licensing is not governance for a community, but we want it to be because we need those things. So, you know, how do we, and those things are, we want licensing to be the solution for that because it's a much easier way to approach it, but we need to actually tackle those hard problems in the way that they're meant to be tackled.
Thank you so much. Madhu, go ahead.
Yeah, I kind of had a related point, you know, that I wanted to explore this idea, you know, Jessica, that you posed initially, how do we kind of promote broader adoption of Rail licenses? And I think what's going to be critical, as Kat mentioned, is kind of understanding the capabilities and limitations of Rail licenses within the larger kind of suite of responsible AI practices, essentially what Rail can do well and what it cannot do. I think, you know, licenses, as I said, can be effective in setting clear expectations and shaping community norms regarding inappropriate uses, but their effectiveness in preventing misuse or economic disruption or disinformation, maybe over-reliance, I think is less clear if licenses are going to be the silver bullet. So if we kind of view responsible AI as a suite of policy levers and there's no single solution, especially, as I said, considering the complexity of general purpose AI systems, I think thinking about the role of model license, for instance, what it can play well and not play well, will be crucial for an even bigger uptake in adoption and the legitimacy of, you know, licenses as a governance lever, which we should encourage model providers to take on.
Yeah, thank you, Madhu. And Danish, I'd love to go to you. And if you have any specific examples you've seen of measuring the impact that Rail licenses have had, or determining the effectiveness, would love to hear about that too.
Sure. So I'll address your question and some of the other points that were raised by the other panelists, right, through some comments. So I think I would agree with what Madhu said, right? Like Rail licenses are not meant to be the silver bullet that just solves or suddenly makes the AI, the problems or the risks of AI go away. That's definitely not the goal. think about why would somebody want to use, why does somebody think about a usage restriction? So Kat gave some examples from the Creative Commons point of view about things that as a community they may or may not agree with. And her point of view is maybe some of these should be codified in principles, right? Or code of conduct guidelines. And one of the things that AI developers often are being encouraged to use are something known as model cards, right? Model cards are basically a summarized but detailed enough interrogation of the model, which are telling you how it was trained, what are its limitations on certain use cases, what has it been tested on, what has it not been tested on. There are certain things that you understand about the model that it cannot do well, and you understand it can do well, and so on, right? There's an intended use for why that is. The question that I would ask is, if you know there is a limitation in your model, regardless of whether it is general purpose or not, and it is a use case that you think as the developer is something that is harmful by a very broad definition of what harm is, why would you not want to enforce it as if it's your community, if it's something that you believe as a community should not happen with your model? Why would you not include it as an enforceable clause in your license? There are many arguments for why that is, and I'll share what the arguments that there are for not wanting to do that. It is because it could make collaboration harder. It is because that why is licensing even the right place to enforce or include usage restrictions? Should this not be governed by a broader legislative mechanism? It's about what would happen if you were to improve the model, and then that usage restriction needs to go away, but you've put in this clause that requires it to be propagated down to other users, right? So you have these kinds of arguments, and they're not without merit. They do make sense. But then you have to think about the flip side. Where is legislation today? Is it going to keep up with laws? Is it going to keep up with the pace of AI development? We want to restrict use and not technology. Perfect. Do we have consensus even across geographies or within geographies about what the usage restrictions need to be? We do not. There are countries in this world that do not even have a privacy law in place. And if we're thinking that we're going to rely on legislation to be the silver bullet, I don't think that's going to be the case either. So we have to recognize that there is rail licenses, much like every other tool that we have in this ecosystem of responsible AI, be it legislation, be it model cards, be it licensing, be it community norms, be it code of conduct guidelines, and all of this, they all need to work together, and there are strengths and weaknesses of each of them. And rail licenses are no different. So that's one thing I just wanted to maybe bring up. And in terms of the measurable impact of where this is happening, I guess when I want to tell you a backstory, like when we started off with rail licenses, right? The argument was there is nothing that can be done because because there is no law to prevent misuse, right? Once we came up with prototype rail licenses, the conversation is now shifted. There is recognition that you can actually do something, because otherwise we would not be sitting here in a panel and talking about whether this is going to hinder collaboration. The point is, yes, you can do something as a developer, as a model creator. I can put in usage restrictions, even in the absence of legislation and regulation. We're now seeing places where people are thinking about whether or not they can use a particular model for a particular use case. And that, I think, is something that is very understated and where community norms have moved in the last 3 years. Because 3 to 4 years ago, the discussion was completely about relying on regulation. So I do think that is measurable impact regardless of whether or not. So you don't have a counterfactual to really be able to say that, it has reduced X sort of use cases or Y kind of use cases. But I think the biggest impact, I would say, from my perspective, the idea of rail licenses and the release of rail licenses have had is shifting the conversation about, well, you actually can do this. Let's just see how it works in the broader ecosystem, and we understand what the limitations are. And I for one, will actually recognize all of the limitations that rail licenses bring in, and we're trying to work on, trying to make tools that would enable and reduce some of those problems. But I guess that's how I would say, I would measure impact at this point of a rail license.
Yeah, thank you so much. This is already a really rich discussion. I'm going to pass it back to Hanlin now, who has a few more questions for you all.
Thanks, Jessica. I'm really enjoying this lively discussion about rail and other responsible AI practices. I wanted to shift the gear a little bit, thinking about, we've mentioned some sort of limitations of rail and other complementary approaches, but I want to look forward a bit, thinking about what are the ways we can move forward with rail and other responsible AI approaches. So this is perhaps a question for all of our panelists to think about. If we were to think about like how Rail is going to unfold in the developer community, how do we envision the expansion of Rail, and what are the maybe to other artifacts, to data sets? I think one of our audience mentioned, how do we see Rail and user licenses being incorporated into common software platforms like Adobe, and what are the options? Just kind of envision like what are the pathways forward for the Rail initiative to be impactful.
So if I may, right? Like, so I think one example that I think we'll all probably relate with is, if I'm a developer today, right, and the open source movement has really been the hallmark by which AI progress has happened in the last couple of years. So if let's just say I'm a developer, and I put in use restriction A, and Hanlin, you are a developer, and you put in usage restriction B. If Carlos wants to combine a project that uses both our work, he needs to account for this, the presence of these usage restrictions, which may or may not be compatible, right? And you can extrapolate this to imagine this is becoming more complex as more and more people start thinking about the use of Rail licenses. So the first thing that, as the Rail initiative, we're thinking about is, how do we make this easier? How do we have tooling? How do we have plugins that actually reduce the burden for developers to actually go through this problem? So you could imagine a place in, let's just say, a code sharing repository where every time you're making a pull request, there is a code scanner that is actually saying, checking the licenses that are there, looking at the usage restrictions, and at least presenting to the user, well, whether or not this combination would be compatible. And some of these could be hard because some of this may require analysis at the usage restriction level. Some of them may be just incompatible by way of the license regime itself. So if you've got an LGPL license, for example, I don't think you can release anything with a Rail license attached with it in a larger project. So I think tooling is one way to go, and standardization is another, right? If you have, for example, license generators, right, that are somewhat standardizing either the language or the pool of licenses that come from, and then tooling that allows people to quickly interrogate and understand what is it that they can or cannot do, would go in a long way forward in addressing some of the gaps and some of the weaknesses that Rail licenses definitely have in the space of enabling collaboration. They are something that I would say slow down collaboration as compared to open source, because that due diligence is required. And in my opinion, I think tooling is something that we definitely need in this space to make this more.
Carlos, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. So from a Hugging Face perspective, I think, first of all, in terms of licensing, we are a neutral platform. So I can be here, of course, promoting Rails, but we have every single kind of platform, and it is the user, the one choosing the license. So the user may choose a Creative Commons license or even an Apache 2.0 license, which is like the most used license in the hub, at least the model hub, the public model hub. So I think from a more mid-ground perspective, beyond Rails, I think the way also to move forward is to explore potential articulations between already existing open licensing tools, such as not just Rails, but also Creative Commons or even open source licenses, and already existing documentation tools such as model cards, data cards. So this concept of explanatory documentation that we included within the big code OpenRail M license, right? So how can existing documentation tools and licensing tools in the AI space articulate, right? Maybe in some years now, or in some months now, we are going to see licenses, openly available licenses, such as a new type of open source license, for instance, including a specific requirement dealing with providing not just a copy of the license, but also a copy of the model card, of the data card. Is this deemed to be a restriction or a field of use restriction under the open source initiative or open source definition? Maybe not, and it's super interesting to assess the case under traditional open source licenses or Creative Commons licenses, right? So this is just another sample of how we could even move forward beyond Rails.
It's really interesting to think about like how collaborative efforts could move forward. So with that, I'm really interested in Madhu and Kat's perspective on this as well. I know both of you have worked on these projects, but Madhu just raise your hand, so go ahead.
Yeah, I think in terms of future directions for Rail, I think one that could be pretty exciting to observe is how different organizations that are developing and releasing foundation models, essentially exploring more open release approaches, like Carlos mentioned with Llama 2's kind of release today. I think kind of observing, one concern that's often voiced is that there's a potential loss of control for model providers around monitoring open releases and preventing misuse downstream. So kind of observing how these model licenses, both rail and rail-like licenses, can empower model providers in addressing these concerns, I think will be essential in increasing adoption. And I feel like now is kind of that period of time where we're going to see a lot more of this happen. And I think we'd better understand what model licenses can really do in terms of empowering model providers.
Yeah, I think my view would be similar in that I think that considering interoperability with the rest of the ecosystem is a big thing, and like how to figure out how to make those the rail licenses work better. My
I think we have some technical issue with Kat's connection.
Of like useful and socially beneficial activity that's finding those as they go forward, or providing curtail political speech, like things like that will have to be ironed out as more usage is adopted.
Thanks, Kat. I think you got cut off for a few seconds. Oh, you're back.
Mostly I was thinking of like having to refine some of the usage guidelines to make sure that it's not cutting off socially beneficial activities, such as like refining and improving video encoding and things like political speech that might currently fall afoul of some of the use guidelines.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think like Danish Mission, like the tooling supporting developers to adopt the license is a one issue, one arm. But I'm also thinking of like how can we create the social environment that make people like finding it easier to use Braille and having the environment to support the social discussion about responsible AI. It's also really another arm that we should aim for. With that, I think we are almost towards the end of the structured questions. So I'm going to start filling into some questions we have got from the audiences. One of the questions that's asked by Raymond is that, do we have a messaging problem when we think about responsible AI, where they mentioned like the public and policymakers, they paint AI with the same brush, regardless of what is a statistical machine learning model or whether it's a generative model, deep learning model. So when we think about that, when there are many branches of AI, so I'm curious about what the panelists are thinking about this. Like when we think about responsible AI, how do we customize our efforts based on the specific AI technology we're thinking about that's out there?
But if I may, I think in my opinion, it has to be more the use case, and maybe we separate out technology, because technology moves so fast that I think I don't even know how relevant that is, because if there's a usage restriction that somebody wants to consider, regardless of how it's implemented, maybe it's something that needs to be regulated if it's something that we view as harm. So just as an example, if we think it's deepfakes, right? If deepfakes are a concern, it doesn't matter whether I've used a GAN or whether I've used Stable Diffusion or if I've used some other algorithm to generate it. It's the use that needs to be regulated or restricted. So I think taking a technology neutral position in some ways could be beneficial, I think, but I haven't really thought through the arguments of not taking a technology neutral position here. Maybe Kat and Madhu are better equipped to shed more light on that.
Yeah, I feel that anything that tries to adapt too closely to any particular technology is going to be obsolete very quickly. So anything that tries to address a harmful use should try and future-proof itself as much as possible, not address a particular method or a particular technology, but be more general about the outcomes that we do and don't want to see.
Madhu, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but I know you have worked on like the ethics and safety review of AI. And so I'm really curious about your thoughts on this. Like, do you see ethics review as more a customizable approach to addressing this type of problems?
Yeah, I'm happy to think through how this can kind of fit in with ethics review in AI research community. So a related anecdote, if that's helpful, in a workshop recently that we conducted on ethics review practices and in AI research, we were kind of exploring the strengths and limitations of impact statements, which are more open-ended kind of explorations of, unintended consequences of a researcher's work, as opposed to checklists, which have also been instituted by kind of AI conferences. And I think the takeaway there was participants kind of highlighted both the advantages and disadvantages of using, prescriptive tools like checklists, which prompt researchers to consider various ethical and societal impacts, and also the drawback of ethics checklists, right? That can sometimes restrict the scope of inquiry, potentially missing out on issues that may be harder for researchers to identify. So I think similarly, a responsible AI license, as I've kind of been saying, should be viewed as one tool among many kind of suite of tools. So we should still encourage researchers to engage in open-ended exercises, to reflect on the downstream consequences of their work, and to disclose them during their publication of their research or model. And this goes to what Danish kind of mentioned, this idea of model cards. Other best practices still exist and might be more amenable to exploring things in a more open-ended space. So I think that's going to be important when we, ask researchers to practice reflexivity, that they examine their assumptions, their practices, their commitments, including considering the broader societal impacts through various lenses. And licenses is one lever that can really help, but it should be used in combination with other kind of open-ended exercises. I think ultimately it's a licensor or the AI researcher leading the project who kind of determines the type of license. So I still think, AI researchers have an important role to play to not limit their scope of inquiry, but to consider, other ways of examining the impact of their work.
Right. I like your point about how we should all reflect on this and explore different approaches. Another question from our audience is thinking about what would be the key points in a pitch to persuade the companies and general counsels of these companies to adopt responsible AI approaches and responsible AI licensing? In other words, what are the positive talking points for executives that oversee developers and middle management?
Well, I think, sorry, Carlos, did you want to say, do you want to go first?
Yeah, may I? Thank you, because then I'm sorry, I will have to leave. So I think, I could talk from a Hugging Face perspective, but we are an ML platform and neutral in terms of licensing. So I think there's no such a point there. What I can speak about is BigCode. Within BigCode, as I was referring before, the two main partners were on the one hand Hugging Face, on the other hand ServiceNow. And ServiceNow is a big tech service-focused company. And we worked with them also in order for their legal team to feel comfortable placing a responsible AI license within their legal infrastructure. We work with them at a point where, as I said, they felt comfortable and they are using this specific license. So yeah, just to say that it's feasible and some companies are already seriously considering it. Thank you so much, Hanlin.
Thanks so much for making it, Carlos. Danish, go ahead.
Sorry, I think more generally, I would just say, if there's a company that's developing AI technology, right, with dual use, and it recognizes the risks of what it can or cannot do, it is something that most companies actually do when they do sign contracts, right? Where if it's a big enterprise that's doing, say, B2B, you do have clear clauses of what you're supposed to be using the technology for and what you do have liability for, or what you're not supposed to do with the technology. Rails are just making this approach more general, right? Like it's because of the way the AI, a lot of ways in which AI technologies are released are not through direct B2B contracts, right? There is also developers who are releasing code. There are companies that are making things available on open source. So it's also just thinking through how downstream use of the technology could, I don't know if I have to pitch this to a C-suite executive, I would just say, do you want a bad use case being powered by your brand name? I don't know, right? Like maybe not. So why would you not take steps to mitigate some of that legal arguments aside?
Madhu, go ahead.
Yeah, if in the spirit of brainstorming, if someone is going to pitch an executive for why they need to have this in place, I think one argument could be if it's a general purpose AI system, arguably it's in its name, right? I think if it's a foundation model, something that can have, a multitude of uses, you couldn't have tested it for every single use. I think usage restrictions and, preventing inappropriate uses become even more important because you just put something on the road that can do many things at once. So I think arguably there's a higher kind of threshold in terms of responsibility for model providers in that instance, that they should kind of try and at least think about, use cases that they absolutely want to prevent. That's one argument for why, for general purpose AI systems, I think licenses are even more important, perhaps. That's not to say that a narrow AI cannot be just as, misused. I think even a text to voice kind of model can be misused in, very obvious ways for fraud or impersonation or scams. So I'm not making the argument that a general purpose AI system is inherently more dangerous than a narrower system. But one really has to kind of question, if you're putting out something that can have a multitude of uses, I think it kind of behooves the person putting it out to think about some uses that they'd like to prevent.
Absolutely. That makes sense. Another question from our audience, I think, is going to be both for Rail and for Creative Commons, where when we think about licensed content, the question is, how would an AI or startup or inventor leverage a Rail license to help monetize their AI inventions? Or ask another way, there are many options, Creative Commons being one of them, but what are the reasons why a for-profit company would want to use Rail? But I'm really curious about your thoughts on this, Kat, because I know like Creative Commons content are also being monetized when there's no Creative Commons, like no commercial use clause. So I was interested in your, like, what you are seeing in terms of using licensing as a way for monetization, because they seem to be like, there's a tension between these two approaches.
Sure, and I'll talk both from Creative Commons and from the general open source software landscape, and that sometimes like there's only one thing in particular that you need to make money from, but a lot of the common, the pieces that are going to be common infrastructure between yourself and a lot of other projects, you get more back in terms of like what you're getting from others' contributions than you would ever get from trying to like keep it to yourself. A lot of people who monetize their open contributions do so through auxiliary things like offering services around it, or offering commercial support, offering services based on it and not on the core pieces of infrastructure themselves. And a lot of those core pieces of infrastructure are the things that are most valuable to share and to get contributions from. In terms of creative content, sometimes there's only like one big platform that's a revenue stream and everything else is just like, would just be nickel and dime. You get a lot more benefit from exposure than you would from trying to restrict all that activity. But everybody's use case is going to be different. And I think others will probably have a better picture of how to monetize the AI offerings, but there's a lot of different business models that you can pursue. And sometimes thinking about like, what are the things that I really need a revenue stream from, and just focusing on that and letting the other things that would benefit more from common development be open is a helpful approach.
Yeah, and I would probably also just say like the idea of licensing through a rail does not limit any sort of commercialization, right? Like it's the open rail licenses permit commercialization. So I think these are orthogonal questions in some sense, that whether or not a rail license can enable commercialization, because by default they can. There's no stopping it. But is it meant to enable commercialization? Definitely not, right? Like the goal of a rail license is just to release, and anybody can release with commercial terms and non-commercial terms, and that's an orthogonal element in my view.
Absolutely. Like there's a whole purpose of a rail, which is to like help to innovate responsibly with certain guardrails. I have one last question from our audience, and then I will pass it over to Jessica to ask the final question. So the one last question from our audience is that we didn't mention Synelac work, which comes back to standards. So it's curious to all of our panelists, what does that perspective fit into this conversation? I'm probably butchering the name of this.
And I'm actually not familiar with that piece of work, but at least if I were to just say something about the standards, I think standardization of rail licenses is key because like we were mentioning, it would just enable better collaboration and reuse of licenses. You don't want people coming up with the same language for the same clause. You don't want poorly crafted clauses. you want to be able to determine what a particular rail license restricts or enable or does not restrict just by having easy means of looking things up. And I think that's where I see roles of, I think standards are definitely a place where that could help, even help with interoperability going forward. But I'm sorry, I'm not aware of the specific work that has been referenced here.
Yeah, I'll say I'm also not familiar with that particular person, but in standardization processes in general, that it's really useful to narrow your view of like what is the thing that cannot be what are the things that cannot be compromised, and what are the things that can be compromised, like what needs to make it into a standard and what doesn't. So that's the thing to consider going forward.
All right. If there's Madhu, if you have do you have anything else to add? If not, I'll pass over to my co-host Jessica for closing it up.
Thank you, Hanlin, and thanks to the audience for the great questions. It's been a really great discussion. So to close us out, we're going to go around the panelists one last time to ask if you have any final closing thoughts, and also if you'd like to share with the audience any ways that people can get engaged with the specific efforts that you're spearheading on responsible AI. Madhu, can we start with you?
Sure. I think one kind of takeaway that I have from this conversation is kind of thinking about a feedback loop around, what are some license violations that we're seeing? What are some usage restrictions that are typically imposed by model providers? Akin to ethics reviews, kind of blogs that come from conference organizers. I think that can be really exciting for folks outside of the computing community like myself to better understand like what's happening at the front lines in terms of model risks. I think that can have a direct impact on other related efforts happening in, either regulation or community norms. So I think that's one takeaway I have from this conversation. As for how people can get in touch, so Partnership on AI has a website, obviously, and we have a contact page where you can sign up for newsletters to get more regular updates or to get directly in touch with us. And yeah, thank you so much, Jessica.
Thank you. Kat, over to you.
Yeah, so I think my biggest takeaway from this conversation is like that the rise of AI has made everyone consider that technology is not neutral. Like technology produces social effects in the world, like the scale at which it operates, and has made people grapple with that. And I think the distinction is not so much like what are the outcomes that we want to see, as so much as like the way that we bring those about. I am a skeptical of the rail approach of putting it in the license, but I'm not a skeptic of addressing the idea that that technology has ethical implications and we should grapple with those in some way. And I think that we do need to do that. It's just a question of how. CC has published some blog material and has some community discussion on AI and responsible use and how that is compatible with an open commons approach. And so if you'd like to continue discussing with Creative Commons, I'd recommend that you check out our blog and our community Slack.
Thank you. And Danish, final word.
Thank you. I think this was a very engaging conversation. And I think it helps just reinforce some of the things that we've heard about rail licenses and their uptake and use, and the questions that we're getting from the audience just tells us that there's a lot that needs to still be done to make sure that people are able to use rail licenses effectively in places where they should be. And I'd just like to maybe use this opportunity to share that we're open. We're an open group. We seek participation from anyone and everyone who would like to contribute towards this. There are many different work streams that we're that we've got running within the rail initiative. We're trying to develop tools, actual tools that people can use. We're also trying to standardize language. We're trying to make things discoverable. We're also trying to learn from feedback about how better to shape and reflect and standardize rail licenses going forward. So if any of you would like to participate or help contribute towards this effort, just please visit our website licenses.ai and you'll find a link to sign up to our Slack channel, and then you can be part of our working groups as you feel interested.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for all the work that you all are doing and for joining us for this discussion. I'm going to pass it back to Rachel now to close us out.
Great. Thank you so much, Jessica. And thank you, Danish, Madhu, Kat, and Carlos, who had to jump a little bit early. Thank you so much for taking the time today for a fantastic discussion. And a huge thank you to folks in our audience for joining us and asking some really thoughtful questions. We really appreciate your participation. So before we close down, I just want to give a big thanks to some of the CLTC supporters, community partners that help make events like this possible. And of course, I'd like to share a few ways that you can get in touch with CLTC as well as our panelists. Yeah, go ahead and follow us on Twitter, head to the CLTC website where you can sign up for our newsletter and stay informed about future events, announcements, research coming out, and much more from CLTC. We also have a link to a virtual workshop that Hanlin put in the chat taking place this October. They're accepting research submissions related to some of the topics that we discussed today. More info can be found at that link in the chat, and you see on your screen here. I'll go ahead and leave this slide up for just a couple more minutes as we close out the hour in case folks want to jot down any information. But yeah, just one final thank you for joining us today. I hope you stay tuned for more events and announcements from CLTC, and we will see you next time. Take care.